All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And today we have Dr. Thoralf Meyer from University of Texas, Austin. Dr. Thoralf is a colleague and a mentor and a cohort. So I did a PhD in his lab in University of Texas, Austin, and he was my kind of supervisor, co-supervisor slash friend while my PhD dissertation in Botswana in Southern Africa. So uh, Dr. Thoralf Meyer is currently doing work in Africa, and he's doing lot of cool groundwork about how fires affect savanna vegetation, what is the biomass in savanna vegetation, both above ground and below ground. And I thank Dr. Thoralf Meyer for joining us and agreeing to give this talk. And over to you, Thoralf.
All right. Yeah. Hello, everybody. As Dr. Mishra said, my name is Dr. Meyer, aka Thoralf. So that's my first name. And yeah, I've been working in the Kalahari, which is located in the central part of Southern Africa, for quite some time. I'm a resident in the country of Botswana, and I'm also a resident in the United States. And here at UT, I teach, you may guessed it, remote sensing and upper division environmental science courses, a field techniques course, a vegetation ecology course, and a class where it is all about field techniques. So from traditional land survey methods to vegetation analysis to cruising around with a drone and mapping applications and things like this. So that's what I do when I'm not in the field. But my reality is that I spend about 8 months a year in the country of Botswana, where I do nothing else but cruise around and essentially chase fire and chase things that eat vegetation, so other than fire. So, but let's jump in and let me start a little bit with just a couple of short notes on scale. So, all of you guys, as far as I know, you have done one form of remote sensing GIS work or the other. So you're either in the drone class or you're in an advanced or introduction remote sensing class. And I think you know about scale. But in remote sensing, we actually often use scales where our sensor is far, far, far away from the object in question. Recently, that has changed with the applications of drones. But if we are looking at things from space, the reality on the ground often looks completely different. And as you guessed, this has got something to do with resolution, has got something to do with spatial resolution, spectral resolution, as well as temporal resolutions. So it is actually very, very important to ground validate remotely sensed data sets. So at least for the development of certain algorithms or for the fine-tuning of algorithms to a particular ecosystem. So because very often things are developed in different systems or in similar systems, but in different places on Earth. So for instance, one of our other colleagues who is now at the University of Los Angeles at UCLA, so he works in the American Southwest, which is essentially a desert/savanna ecosystem. But what we are observing there is often a little bit different than what we observed on the other side of the planet in Southern Africa. So scale essentially matters. So, and we are moving from a regional scale downwards to a very, very localized scale. And these localized scales are important to essentially validate what we are seeing on our satellite imagery. So, and today, and some of my colleagues here, they are all about programming, using codes, running Python or R codes to analyze imagery, etc., etc. And what we often forget is essentially that we know something about the ecology on the ground. So, and when it comes to savanna ecology, it becomes quickly very, very complex, essentially. But to boil this down, the savanna ecosystem can essentially be split in two systems, in the ecological system as well as the social system. So we need to see things in a social context, and I will get to this a little bit later. So, but when it comes to the ecology side of things, water availability is probably one of the main factors that determine the functioning of savannas. And traditionally, savannas are, well, not traditionally, but savannas are a highly productive ecosystem where a lot of the energy, the net primary productivity that is produced on an annual basis is essentially available for consumption. This is not the case in a rainforest, for instance, where we see way higher productivity rates, but this productivity is often not available for consumption because it is put into woody components, which essentially are not food for most species. So in savannas are characterized by grasslands, or essentially grasslands, and that this grass forms the basis for herbivory, so for grass or plant-eating species, and therefore these plant-eating species remove the biomass that is produced. And what they also remove is essentially fuel. And we in the United States, we forget that sometimes, especially over the last couple of years, that fuel removal plays an important role when it comes to fire risk. So animals that remove these fuel types, and that could be grass for grazers, like typical grazer would be a buffalo in Africa, or a wildebeest or a zebra. And we do have browsing species that essentially affect how shrubs grow, etc. So, and this relationship between browsers, grazers, shrubs, and grasses becomes very, very complex, and is essentially another form that removes fuel is fire. So, and fire has been part of the world or of this planet for a very, very long time. And today, especially in Africa. So if it wouldn't be for the oceans that that coined the term the blue planet, if the ocean wouldn't be there, it should probably be called the red planet. So, and in the case of Africa, essentially Africa is often referred to as the fire continent. Africa, as far as science is concerned, is also the place of origin of humankind. And humans traditionally have used fire for a very, very long time. And it is probably fire that brought civilization to the point where we are today. So most early uses of fire are actually, from an archaeological point of view, they are linked to the continent of Africa. And fire is used for a variety of things. So if we think fire and humans in uses, we probably think very first of cooking or heating or something like this. But fire has also been used as a tool. It has been used in tool making traditionally. It has been used for hunting, and it has certainly been used historically as a weapon. So to drive somebody out, to drive an enemy away from a certain area or into a certain area, etc. So, and as pastoralism actually became the main form of a lifestyle, fire was often used to clear land. So in certain areas where civilization or humankind has been present for thousands of years, fire has shaped entire landscapes. And this is very, very true for Africa, and it holds true for most grassland ecosystems. In fact, grassland ecosystems have a codependency on fire in most parts of the world, so at least in Asia, in the North America, Central America, South America, Australia, as well as Africa. So fire is an essential component of a landscape. Fires need to happen for these landscapes to survive. The big question is, what is my ideal fire frequency? And this is where science is lacking a little bit behind, and it is a question that is very difficult to determine. But let's talk about something else quickly, and let's chat a little bit about fire ecology. So when it comes to fire, three things are essentially important. So, and this is often referred to as the fire triangle. So when it comes to fire, the environmental conditions are a big component that enables or disables the occurrence of fire. And because the environmental conditions, such as weather and climate, essentially have a heavy influence on fuel availability. And then what else needs to go into this fire triangle is we need a source of ignition. I will talk to this in just a second. And we need a sufficient amount of fuel to keep a fire essentially rolling, to keep it burning. It's a little bit like your campfire. So, but let's rip this apart and let's have a closer look at this for just a second. So from a weather component, from a weather point of view, so the weather today or on a day where a fire occurs anywhere, things like wind play an important role because wind is essentially responsible for the spread and the intensity of a particular fire because it is wind that supplies the oxygen that is needed for a fire to essentially burn. So weather also influences parameters such as rainfall, humidity, and temperature. And these three components together essentially influence the fuel moisture content. So how dry is my fuel, or how easily is it to ignite a piece of grass, a piece of wood, etc., etc. So weather plays a very, very important role. Versus climate, which also plays an important role because climate is one factor that on a long run is responsible for certain characteristics of biomes or ecosystems. So, and it is climate where long-term rainfall, long-term temperature, etc., essentially are responsible for the primary production. So the primary production, so net primary productivity, is nothing else but an expression of the amount of fuel that is available in a particular system. So the amount of energy that is grown by plants that then ignites where this energy is essentially released. So from an energetic point of view, climate is a very, very important component here. And then let's go on and let's talk a little bit about essentially about the sources of ignition. So when we think about how to ignite a fire, there are essentially we can differentiate between two ways. So there's an anthropogenic pathway and there's a natural pathway. When it comes to natural fires, lightning is about one of the only sources of ignition that is essentially out there. So if we're thinking about this, for lightning to happen, we need at least convective thunderclouds somewhere in the atmosphere. We need a discharge that then makes it to the ground, hits the fuel, ignites the fuel. So it is a chain reaction that is actually observed relatively often, but all these components like the strength of the discharge, that it strikes an ignitable material, that there is enough material actually to ignite, and then there is enough material that actually creates a wildfire, for instance. This doesn't happen very often. So there is a lot of random at play here that makes ignition through lightning statistically, or gives that a low probability. So, and then there is the entire group of natural lightning, or the component of natural lightning that I would call, that falls into the category spontaneous combustion. And spontaneous combustion can, for instance, happen in your compost heap, for instance, where chemical or biochemical processes essentially create a lot of heat, and that heat might be enough to ignite a certain material. So spontaneous combustion also occurs when I have electrically charged dust particles in sawmills, for instance. This can happen. So if these dust particles essentially create friction with each other that could lead to an electrical discharge. And in fact, in sawmills, that can lead literally to an explosion of a particular storage or a chamber, etc. So these are natural forms, lightning and spontaneous combustion are natural forms of how to create a spark, how to ignite a wildfire, for instance. And then there are anthropogenic forms. So anthropogenic forms are essentially that somebody intentionally sets fire to something, or they are non-intentional, like accidents, or somebody did not extinguish the campfire somewhere in California, and then suddenly we see large wildfires spreading through California and threatening lives and property, etc., etc. So these natural as well as anthropogenic are our only sources, essentially, of ignition. So for now, we've spoken about the climate and ignition component, and now I would like to talk a little bit about characteristics of fuel. So, and when it comes to characteristics of fuel, the characteristics of fuel, they differ from one ecosystem to the next. So they are different in a forest ecosystem in California versus a grassland ecosystem in Oklahoma or in Texas. Oh yeah, by the way, Texas at the moment, I think we're experiencing the second largest wildfire in Texas history at the moment, and these are grass fires. And grass fires, they behave a little bit differently than forest fires because there is less energy to essentially burn in grasses versus in woody vegetation. Grass is easier to ignite than woody vegetation, but woody vegetation, especially combined with correct or with adequate wind speeds, creates a higher energetic release. So they are significantly more severe. We will get back to that. But fuel characteristics are essentially important. On an ecosystem level, it's like, what is the big question is, what is my decomposition rate? So how quickly does my organic material, my dead organic matter, essentially disappear from the system and is recycled back into the soil, into the atmosphere, etc. So some systems, especially dry ecosystems, and especially dry grassland ecosystems, have the ability to retain fuel over years. So due to relatively low decomposition rates. So then the shape of it piece of fuel also plays a role. So I want you to think of it like if you have something that is round, like a stick that is round, for instance, that stick is more difficult to ignite than if you would have a square block of the same size, for instance. So fuel shape plays an important role. Fuel size plays an important role because it is certainly more difficult or it needs more energy to ignite a log that is, let's say, 7 inches in diameter versus a twig that is bone dry and is about 1/4 of an inch in diameter. So fuel size plays a very important role. And something that a lot of people don't pay attention to, that is the arrangement. So how is essentially fuel arranged in 3-dimensional space in my landscape? And you, or for those of you who like going camping and building a campfire, you will know that one should leave essentially air spaces between your logs and not densely put all your logs together and then try and ignite this with a lighter. This is not going to work, or it will take a very, very long time at least. So the fuel arrangement essentially determines how much moisture is lost during a fire. And it also determines something that is referred to as the fuel to air ratio, so, or fuel to oxygen ratio. And that's a very, very important component that needs to be considered. So 3-dimensional structure is very, very important in the assessment of fires. So, but let's talk a little bit about fire regimes before we jump into some actual fire stuff. So when it comes to fire regimes are essentially made up of 4 components. And the first one is fire frequency. And fire frequency is essentially answers the question, how often does the same area burn? And fire frequencies for ecosystems differ. In savanna ecosystems, fire frequency could be naturally, or fire frequency could be from 1 year to about 10 years. For boreal forest ecosystems, for instance, the fire frequency is said to be 200 years plus. So meaning a piece of boreal forest burns every 200 years with varying effects. So this is fire frequency. So the big question is, how often does my system actually burn? And the other one is fire season. So in our case in Botswana, we have a distinct wet season, or growth season, and a distinct dry season. Now there is a big difference if a fire hits a certain area at the beginning of the dry season or the end of the dry season. And this is related to fuel moisture. So at the beginning of the dry season, my fuel is still relatively wet. Yes, it will burn, but most of the fire's energy actually goes into evaporating water. So, and it is lost, therefore, or not lost, but it's transferred into the atmosphere, and is therefore not available to burn more stuff. So therefore, these fires are often referred to as cold fires. And then we have our late dry season fires. Now, by now, my fuel is bone dry, and essentially it contains very little to no moisture. So everything goes into the burning of that fuel. Every single joule, every calorie of energy goes into burning this piece of fuel. So which then creates an extremely hot fire, especially in combination with increased wind speeds. So, and then wind speed is also something that has an influence on fire intensity. And fire intensity is nothing else but how much area is essentially affected by this fire. So how much area has been burned versus fire severity. Fire severity essentially increases with temperature, increases with wind speed, which in turn increases the temperature. And it's essentially fire severity determines how big is my impact. So is my ecosystem burned into the ground? Is there nothing else but bare soil left? Or has it just scorched some leaves? Or has it only affected the undergrowth in a particular area? Has it only affected my grass layer and not my shrub layer, etc., etc.? So frequency, seasonality, intensity, and severity are big, big, big components when it comes to fire and fire research. All right, folks. So for now, I will take you to my other home, or to my main home, and it's the country of Botswana. It's located in the dead center of Southern Africa. It's a landlocked country, and it's essentially a savanna ecosystem. Botswana, as a country, it's politically, it's also referred to as the Switzerland of Africa, because due to its economic, social, etc., and political stability. But from an environmental point of view, it's all a semi-arid environment. It's a savanna environment. And this savanna is essentially made up of grasslands, open shrublands, and some wooded areas further to the north. So Botswana is also has some of the largest terrestrial national parks or protected areas on this planet. One of them, or the more famous ones, are the Makgadikgadi National Park, Chobe National Park, the Okavango Delta, and the Kgalagadi Transfrontier Park, which is the first protected area that was established between multiple countries. So this, to establish a national park over multiple countries, by the way, is an African idea. For a change, it is not an American idea, it's an African idea. So, and it was first pushed through under somebody called Nelson Mandela. And it was established between a country of Botswana and the country of South Africa, and then a couple of other countries. All right, so now in Botswana, the human population, or the large part of them, essentially rely on natural resources. And the main form of income is essentially ranching. So ranching is the production of livestock for various markets. So for the European market as well as the African market itself. So, but from an ecological point of view, so we actually have a distinct wet and a distinct dry season. So our wet season ranges from November to about April, so right now, with varying rainfall from one year to the next. Like this year, for instance, we have very, very little rain, means we have very, very little productivity, very, very little production, very little fuel, a low fire risk. Versus last year, we had a very, very good rain year. So it is green all over. It produces a lot of grass. And this grass remains throughout the dry season, which creates a high fire risk. So our natural range is pretty large. So it's from 300 millimeters a year, that's almost desert condition, to about 700 millimeters a year, which should be about the same you guys get up there in the north. So, and these rainfall conditions determine essentially the vegetative growth as a driver of fires in this case. So, and then we do have some significant disturbances in our ecosystems. So we do have some big animals that are running around removing fuel. So each and every single one of these little things here, they eat about every 4 days. They eat as much vegetation as a Volkswagen Golf weighs. To put this into perspective, so every 4 days, so we've got 150,000 of these things running around. So that's quite a large number of fuel removing big lawnmowers, essentially. So they have a very, very large impact on the environment. And on top of our wildlife, we do have a significant population of livestock. In Botswana, the human population is 2.3 million people. We have got over 6 million heads of cattle running around in the country that also remove fuel, essentially all day long. And disturbances, as you may guess, we also have a very, very high fire occurrence throughout the country, which varies. And very early in my, let's say, scientific career, I became interested in looking into these disturbances. I started off with livestock and wildlife, and then moved into wildfire research. So, and it became a necessity because in Africa, traditionally, everybody is doing research on animals. So this is the sexy stuff, essentially. This is where the money is. This is where a zoo gives you a grant to study lions or elephants or whatever. But what is often not taken into account is that this lion and this elephant essentially depends on productivity and wildfire and vegetative growth, etc. And there is a strong interaction between vegetative growth, wildfires, and herbivore activity. So in this, actually, over time, we developed a couple of questions together with some authorities, because we wanted to get to the point where we can develop some management guidelines for large-scale savanna management, let this be in conservation areas or on somebody's extremely large cattle ranch. So, and we wanted to see if we can use some sort of a forecast model to inform fire response units, as well as to develop a fire management plan. So, and for me personally, we developed a set of questions like, what's the historical fire regime in the region actually? What are we actually looking at? Because everybody was always saying, there's too much fire, and it destroys our environment and kind of things. But nobody could actually pin some numbers to it. And so that's why we came up with the idea to develop a fire frequency map and have a look at the entire country or the entire region, essentially. And we wanted to also look in how does essentially vegetation mortality relate to fuel load. So how much fuel load do I need to kill a tree, in other words? So, and then eventually we looked into, if that tree is destroyed or if the vegetation is destroyed, how does it regrow? Does it regrow exactly the same as it was before, or does it change the composition of tree species? Does it shape the morphology, the looks of a tree, or what does it do? Nobody knew anything about that. We know things, we know some research had been done in South Africa, which is a different system, and in the American Southwest, and a lot has been done in Australia, but that's all not really directly applicable to our system. So we started looking into fire frequencies, and we essentially see that on a first look, our fire frequencies are relatively high in the high rainfall areas in the north, which would make sense because more rainfall means more productivity. But we also see that there's still a pretty high fire frequency in the middle of the country, stretching all the way to the south. So we will have a closer look into this at a later point. So we established a timeline. In this case, we used essentially a variety of MODIS products to determine that. And while we were at it, we also looked into fire seasonality. And we saw that over the last 10 years, we actually saw a slight shift in seasonality from early season cold fires to hotter fires by the end of our dry season. So certainly something is happening there with regards to a shift in seasonality. So, and now, since Botswana, yes, it is a wild country, but there are people living there. And people essentially, it was people that carved the entire country up into land management units. So in this particular case, we're looking at Botswana's protected areas. Botswana is a country that has about 50% of its jurisdictional territory under some form of nature conservation. So it's a very, very high percentage. So this is how this looks like. It's almost all connected. So, but apart from our protected areas, we have essentially, cattle ranching areas, in this case in brown, and we do have communal free-range grazing areas where local communities essentially graze their livestock. So now, in our case, we focus on one particular region, and that is it's called the Khansi district, with one of the largest wildlife reserves on the right, that's Central Kalahari Game Reserve, a couple of wildlife management areas in green, the commercial farm block, that's the light brown, and then the reddish brown is a communal grazing area. And we essentially looked at this, and we actually saw that most of our fires essentially happen within our protected areas themselves, and our wildlife management areas, and almost nothing burns in the commercial ranching areas. So we also, in this case, had a closer look at seasonalities, and similar to what we saw, especially in the wildfire areas, inside the protected areas, we also saw a shift in seasonality. So now this is, as I said, we used MODIS to have a look at a very, very coarse scale here. And then we started to essentially zoom in. And we were given the opportunity to conduct or to set up field experiments on a private game ranch where we could do our own controlled burns. So in order to do this, we've picked a region where it is relatively safe to burn, and we cut that region up into 3 sectors. It's burn area 1, 2, and 3. And each and every one of them essentially have 3 plots in there where we hand measure every single piece of vegetation, almost every blade of grass, and the top section. So we did this for the first time, 2016, and then burned the whole lot down. So the area in total is about 15 football fields of size. So we burned that completely into the ground in 2016. So, and then since 2016, we essentially started to burn the area 1 every single year, burn area 2 every other year, and area 3, we let this one sit until essentially last year and lit it up again. So what we have established here is essentially a different fire frequency that allows us to look at the impact of a change in the frequency of fires. Does this change my vegetation more than under a different fire regime or not? So, and these experiments have been running relatively well for us. So every single year, I've become a little bit of a pyromaniac by now. So, and just dropping a match in there is, for us, it's serious fun to essentially burn this into the ground and take our measurements. So what we do is we take pre-measurements before the burn, and we take the same measurements again after the burn. So and that establishes or allows us to essentially get a trajectory or a growth trajectory development trajectory for every single plant inside these plots. So, and now in this case, we looked at mortality rates, for instance, how many shrubs and trees, and what kind of shrub and tree, and what tree height, or which height category of a tree is affected to what particular degree by the fires. So there are a lot of questions answered. And we can actually measure the amount that regrows per year, because I haven't mentioned that at the beginning, but we are also taking about 20 students to this site every single year, where students do nothing else but measure vegetation. And my early students, they did nothing else but essentially killing 3,000 trees. So they cut down 3,000 trees and took their weights. And they related the weight to an easy to measure parameter in this case. And this is the crown area, the height, and the stem diameter, essentially. So by now, we don't need to cut any trees down anymore. We just can measure easy to measure parameters and use regression to essentially determine what the regrowth in weight is. And weight is related to CO2, so to carbon that is assimilated in the plants. It is related to energetic release in the case of a wildfire, and a bunch of other growth parameters, and carrying capacities for livestock, and or in this case game. It's a game range in this case. And we can use these localized models to essentially then go back to our larger scale here. This is where Dr. Mishra and I did some work on this a couple of years back, where we used Modis time series and a spectral mixing approach to essentially reconstruct how a pixel is made up. So how much green vegetation is in there, how much dead vegetation is in there, how much soil is exposed. So, and we can use these models to essentially scale that up. So, and another thing we're doing is we're using these weight equations to essentially relate this to fire intensity. In other words, we're relating it to temperature. So in this case here, we are wiring the entire place up with a bunch of measurement stations that are using thermocouples, and they essentially measure heat or heat release in 3 dimensions, so in vertical space. And if we're looking at this, we're actually seeing this, that at a particular elevation, fire or the temperatures are significantly higher. This creates a higher impact. A plant cell, for instance, a leaf cell, dies at 60 degrees Celsius. So that leaf is then essentially dead, burned. Wood ignites at 350 degrees Celsius, or cellulose, for instance. So, and we were actually able, in a controlled burn, I have to admit, or not admit, I have to mention here that we are not burning at wind speeds above 3 meters per second, which is essentially no wind at all. And under these conditions, we already reached significant temperatures, so in the order of 700 degrees. So to put this into perspective, aluminum or aluminium essentially melts at about 650. So by now we have been able, last year actually, I've been able to measure a real wildfire. So I had the doubtful pleasure to find myself in one. And I was able to measure temperatures, and we measured temperatures in there in excess of 1,200 degrees. This roughly melts steel, to put this into perspective. So, so we did this, we measured this, we record this, and then we look at these parameters and relate this to our death rates. So, and if we're seeing essentially that a significant amount of vegetation on the right-hand side in the bar graph actually is affected by the fire in one way or the other. This is categorizable. We'll get to this in just a second. And as we moved on with this research, we actually came to a point where we just had more and more and more questions. So first of all, so far we figured out that trees, because the main driver, the fuel continuation, is driven by the occurrence of grasses, and grasses are never higher than knee high, let's put it that way. And this also leads to a point where vegetation that's larger than is essentially not affected by fire at all. But it kills a lot of saplings, so it does have an effect on regrowth. And but let's continue with this for just a second and let me run you through something. At some point, we had the luck, so to say, to measure a real wildfire. This is a fire that occurred in 2017, and it burned for about a month inside Central Kalahari Game Reserve, and it burned an area the size of Holland and Belgium together. So, and we used an approach that is actually used by the United States Department of Agriculture that uses near-infrared bands and shortwave infrared bands to determine, to classify severity of a fire based on Landsat imagery. And we did this and categorized that. We went into the field with a team and took a bunch of ground measurements. Luckily, we had fuel monitoring stations out in this area that essentially burned. This was a we had 3 consecutive years of very, very good rain. To give you an idea how much fuel accumulates here, this probably puts it into perspective. So this is a full-size 4-wheel drive vehicle. So there are serious amounts of fuel, good fuel to air ratios, but there are still slight differences on the ground. So not every single ecosystem or habitat has the same amount of fuel, which leads to changing intensities throughout my landscape. So, and we drove in there about 5 days after the burn, and the photo on the left gives you an indication on how that looked like. So it's essentially everything looks dead, everything is burnt into the ground. However, the photo on the right is roughly the same place about 2.5 months later, with no water availability, nothing. To give you a better idea, this probably tells you this is exactly the same shrub or tree after the fire and 2.5 months later. So fire in this case, this part of the research there, so we have set up over 60 monitoring stations. And we essentially established that after one growth season, a shrub that has been burned into the ground where there's nothing visible anymore will be back to about 70% of its volume, 45% of its mass after 1 year of growth. So now the management handbook for this area essentially tells you to use fire to get rid of shrub encroachment or to control a problem called shrub encroachment. And what we are finding out here actually, that fire is not a good tool to fight shrub encroachment in this particular part of the Kalahari. So, and the high impact was all related to the amount, yet again, of fuel that is essentially available in the system. So by now, we found a couple of things, but yet again, so we essentially found out that there is a lot more that we need to look at over time. And it, yet again, as it is in science, it raised more questions than we essentially could answer. So essentially, fire, bottom line is, fire doesn't kill trees. I always say that in this particular system, what kills trees is melons, cucumbers, and frost. So because these are creepy creepers. So it's essentially where the leaves of melons and the leaves of certain types of cucumbers, wild melons, wild cucumbers, essentially encapsulate an entire tree and therefore take away the ability of the tree to photosynthesize. And over a year, that tree will draw on its batteries, which are essentially the root system, and take the energy that's stored in the root system to produce more leaves and fight this cucumber. And at some point, it will lose that fight and eventually will die in this case. So there are a couple of other things we need to answer. So by now, we are deploying, in fact, multispectral drones to fly this. So we have just gotten our hands on one. And this will be used going forward from the end of April this year. So we're expecting some more the results on that end. And yeah, so we're really, really looking forward to that. But bottom line is that we need to ground validate our remote sensing work and to make that a little bit more meaningful, number one, and B, to essentially fine-tune localized or models for localized or local conditions that we are seeing on the ground, in our case, for the Kalahari. Yeah, folks. So on that note, I would like to open the floor up for questions, if there are any, folks.
Awesome, thank you. Students, some questions, please. Any questions that you think you have?
I'll ask a quick question, I suppose. How many of your students do you take over to your study site?
And Andrew, it varies. So I'm running a study abroad program here out of the University of Texas. And this study abroad programs take about anywhere between 15 and 20 every single year, except for COVID. So, but we've done that since 2012 now. And I have to admit, I actually really enjoy that because this is practical field work. And at any university, students are very seldom given the opportunity to actually get their hands dirty, take some measurements, and do the cool stuff. What science is all about, and do something other than just crunching bits and bytes on a computer. So about
Right.
20. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Someone, questions? Zach, Emma, Stephen, anyone?
Was there any environmental constraints that affected your research indirectly?
What do you mean?
I mean in the aspect of do you think if you did this in another area of the Kalahari, would you produce the same results?
This is a very good question, sir. This is a very valid question because in the Kalahari we see a natural change in vegetation density and woody vegetation density from the south to the north, and we have actually just recently in 2022 we have started a similar experiment in a completely different region, which is a little bit more open. It has got less shrubby vegetation, and we are. At this point, it's too early to say. We have only burnt these areas twice. So versus these ones, we have burnt multiple times. So there is, at this point, it is too early to say what the effects are down there. So, but we have started that, and we have actually added, or we would like to add another component to that. So here comes the crazy part. So we have just been building a research station down there, and I would like to use volunteers that do nothing else but look after our sheep. So we're gonna get the sheep herd, and then we're gonna do the same experiments with different intensities of sheep, essentially animals that remove vegetation. So and add this on top of our fire component, so which makes it even more complex. So, but yes, so we have taken this somewhere else, but at this point in time, I cannot say. We don't have any results yet because these are long-term studies. So, and unfortunately, in science, very often, people don't have time to do long-term studies. Long-term studies are expensive. There's a lot of money involved in this and components like this. But maybe, Zach, when you are the professor, you invite me to give a talk, then I might have some answers for you.
Very, very cool. I like the how you're gonna incorporate livestock to your data site or your site of study. That's pretty cool way, an interesting way of, you're right, making it very complex.
Yeah, I can't wait. I'm looking forward to this, but it's still a little bit away, as I said. So we need to build enclosures. We need to have people on site that essentially look after the livestock. So, and that needs to be 24/7. So that's not just, like quick get somebody from the United States for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks. No, I need to have an entire team that does nothing else but look after sheep. And then, these sheep reproduce. So we need to do something with the sheep. So we either need to give them away to the community or sell them or whatever. So it's pretty complex, that goes to it, but I'm looking forward to it, to admit.
Thanks, Thoralf. You have done some incredible work. I was just wondering if what's your thought as a foots on the ground fire expert, and also looking at the remote sensing products. What is the remote sensing people missing, or how right are they when we are looking a pixel of 500 meter, and now you're also looking with a drone? What do you see can remote sensing give? What is it missing? What can it add? What's your perspective on that?
It's so, I mean, obviously with drone flights, we can cover a relatively small area with a relatively high spatial resolution, which gives us a very good result for, let's say, if somebody wants to monitor his own ranch, which is like a couple of hectares, 2,000 hectares, 5,000, 10,000 hectares. So drone transect might be something that is completely feasible on that. So, but on a large scale, we are left with things like, in this case, Landsat, MODIS for the entire country. And very often we see, in our case, actually, we have looked into that both, or all three, MODIS, Sentinel, as well as Landsat, are actually underestimating the severity. If we are using the scale that has been produced by the United States Department of Agriculture, so if we're using something that is called the normalized burn ratio, which uses shortwave infrared and near infrared to derive severity, and we are underestimating that in these particular savanna environments. So a problem with this is also the temporal resolution of Landsat, in particular in Sentinel, and because it is a grass fire, and these indices highly depend on a change in reflective values in these particular bands. And these changes are caused by ash. And if ash essentially is blown around on day number 2 after the fire, I do not see that signal anymore on a Landsat image. So I get a completely different picture if I just measure essentially 2 days after the fire, at the day of the fire, or 2 weeks later. Very often it's not sufficient. So the temporal resolution of Landsat and Sentinel gives us big trouble. MODIS, due to its large footprint in this case, gives us a good regional picture, but on a per farm, it's like 10,000 hectare. No, it's not ideal. So we still all need to, extrapolate up, and we do have some degree of error in there. There is no doubt on that, but we are trying to use our field data to get these errors as much down as possible. I'm personally hoping that we can do more with hyperspectral. So that's something that's on the horizons. We will, hopefully, we're debating that. We are discussing with some private hyperspectral company if we could get some images to test and run certain mixture or unmixing procedures over them. So, and my big hope is that we're getting some better understanding of that, and that I can build some libraries, some end member libraries for burned areas in the Kalahari. So that's my retirement plan, actually. So, so we'll do that. We will do that. Yeah, cool.
150,000 elephants. how do you think, that and fire kind of, which is affecting it more? And I know the north has more elephants, right? Um, ecosystem structure wise, how, like, if we have to assign a number that, okay, two points to the elephants, 8 points to the fire in terms of restructuring the ecosystem structure, would you go like 2 versus 8, or like 8 versus 2, elephant versus fire?
Okay, in northern Botswana, I would give 10 out of 10 to elephant, or 9 out of 10 to elephants. Okay, and if it is just between elephants and fire, right, I would give 9 to elephants in the north and 1 to fire. In the southern part of the country where we don't have elephants anymore, so naturally they disappear. They need water essentially, and there is no water in the Kalahari. So I would say it is fire is the biggest influence on vegetation and livestock, and mainly overgrazing, essentially. So there, elephants are replaced by cattle and by goats and by sheep. So now I would say the 6 would go to livestock, and the 4 would go to fire, versus it is 9 against 1 for elephants in the north. So elephants are relatively destructive and are an ecosystem engineer, I would say, or some ecologists would say, or a keystone species that influences how vegetation looks like, how overgrazed, that determines the occurrence of woodlands or not, and a couple of other factors. A big factor, elephants, often underestimated.
Wow, thank you. Any questions? Any more students would like to ask any questions?
Is there any increase in the frequency of fires down there, or is it pretty similar because it's still like the rainy and the dry season?
In terms of frequency, we can't say that at this point. So we don't have any results that are strong enough to suggest that there is an increase in frequency statistically. So we don't have that. So that's why I can't really say it. What we are now looking into is more of and the reason for this being is that we have used MODIS, and MODIS only goes back to, essentially, we only have 23 years of records. So now, how powerful are 23 years of records if we're looking at the change over time? So 20 years might be a little bit too short of a period to actually say our frequency has increased. So my gut feeling is yes, it does have increased, but that's my gut feeling, and it's not scientifically proven. I don't have the numbers for it because how short essentially our wall-to-wall coverage is for MODIS. So I think MODIS was launched at some point in 2000. So that gives us 23 years of records. This is not a very long record in ecology. So, and there is no way around it. So this is one big limitation on remote sensing, its availability of remotely sensed data. So one of the older legacy products, Landsat, goes back to 1972, but there was not enough coverage. Essentially, I think March 72, Landsat, the first MSS or whatever was launched. Yeah, March 72, I think. So that's an issue. So the answer is no, I cannot see an increase in frequency.
Excellent. Now, a lot of people have joined us. Anyone would like to ask one of two last few questions to Dr. Meyer? So did you guys like lease this property, Thoralf? I'm like burning everything down. How do you manage that?
No, I mean, look, the farming community. So this is a private ranch, okay, and the farming communities, they have an interest. It is their land, and they have a problem with too much shrub cover. So they have this effect like shrub encroachment, which has been reported throughout the world, all over. And scientists are not really clear what causes it. Changes in the hydrological cycle, increased CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, changes in land use, in grazing intensities, etc. So we don't really have a clue what drives shrub encroachment. But for these people on the ground is, if now my farm is so encroached that my livestock can't utilize the area anymore, if I have 50% shrub encroachment on my area, I have 50% less land available to do what I do for a living, and that is produce milk or produce livestock or something. So these guys down there, they are actually keen to get research people in. They support us here with food, with accommodation. They build us a camp. They build us, a little where we have a shower, where we have a cooking area and where we have a toilet and some places to slap some tents down and electricity to charge instruments and things like this. And then they have set aside, the farmer here had said, is like, guys, you can use this area, the entire area. You just call me, and they get a bulldozer out essentially to essentially remove all the vegetation. So think of it like they're grading its triple wide road in there, so that the fire from our control burn can't jump into the actual farm area. So and they do this kind of stuff. So the support from the community is huge because they want to have these problems solved. They finally want to know, hey, what is that? And they do understand that sometimes it takes years to do this, but they are very supportive. I have to admit, I've got no problems with any of these farmers now.
Awesome.
So,
do you have like any fun stories about big cats while you were burning, that kind of roaming around, or something that you want to share with the students?
Not necessarily while we were burning. So because I'm actually always afraid that we're going to kill something. Kill a turtle is a big one or something. That would make me sad. So we're trying to scout our areas, the 15 football fields for, but in the entire time, I've actually never seen a dead animal in any wildfire area even. So this is controlled. I'm talking wildfires. I've never seen a dead animal, not a tortoise, not a snake, not an antelope, nothing. I don't know how. And I've walked and driven through these areas for kilometers. So I've got no idea. But fun area, fun things. Yeah. So this year, for the first time, we were working on somebody's private ranch. And it's right next to a big national park. And there were 2 lions laying there. And I said to my colleague, let's get into the car. Come on, let's go and have a look at these lions. So we drive up to these lions and take some photos, it's like social media post, Instagram. And so ding, ding, take some photos. And as I drive past these lions, one of them stood up and jumped at my car and bit in the tire. He bit my spare wheel to shreds. Cost about $300 of damage. And then they walked straight into our campsite and harassed us all night long. I did not sleep a single minute that night. They walked in the tent, around the trailer, around the car. There's like rolling around in the sand right in front of the tent. So it's like that was one of the most horrible nights I've ever had in the bush, I have to admit.
I lost you there for maybe 30, 40 seconds. I don't know about you students. Did you guys lose him too, or it was just me?
I heard everything.
All right. Okay.
Scary story.
So these things happen, but generally it is relatively safe. So this is an exception, what I just said, and it was just me. It was not me and my students. I would never take my students to work in these areas where there's real stuff around. So that's UT would not allow that, or any other university in this world would probably not allow that. So
Excellent.
yeah, so there are some stories. So guys, get out there, do some field work, grab any opportunity to gain some experience. What I tell my guys always is good grades are not rare. Experience and skills are. All right, guys. So get out there, get some experience, get some skills under your belt, put this onto your CV, and therefore be more competitive, folks. Huh? All
So,
right.
Thoralf, thank you so much. I think we have exhausted our time here. Yeah, I think our student learned a lot, and I owe you a beer or more. So for your time today.
Yeah,
And
come to the field again.
yeah, sure. I will try. In the future for some time. Sure. Thanks for the invitation. And I'll let you go, Thoralf, now, and have a good day.
All right. Have a
Thank
good
you.
one.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Here.
Bye.
Bye, Thoralf. Bye, everyone.